President Donald Trump surprised countries around the world last week by announcing he would double tariffs on metal imports to 50%.
Just made an announcement of an expansion of the existing 25% tariffs.
We become too dependent on the United States as our biggest customer. We must diversify our trade relationships.
Detroit was caught off guard. Steel had disappeared, and the Motor City was plunged into turmoil like a speeding train. And the city had gone from bustling manufacturing to empty lines in a matter of days. Why did America's closest ally, Canada, abruptly stop exporting almost all metals? Was there more to this than a trade war? Canadian steel imports into the United States had nearly completely stopped by early July 2025. Not a slowdown, but a complete freeze. What industry insiders fear was confirmed by customs data. Supplies had ceased. It wasn't just numbers, either. Silent loading docks, empty rail cars, and Detroit manufacturers frantically searching for 3 times as expensive substitute suppliers. At the same time, Hamilton, Ontario steel mills were operating at full capacity about 250 miles distant. Parking lots were starting to fill up again, overtime had returned, and night shifts had been resumed. On the other side of the border, however, American supply chains were collapsing. The cost of raw materials was soaring, building projects were halting, and the industrial core of the country was descending into a silent catastrophe. How did Trump's tariff approach backfire so rapidly, and what had prompted Ottawa to impose such an abrupt freeze? Canada's plants were booming back to life, while Detroit's were slowing down. The Canadian government had surreptitiously shifted demand inward without making any public announcements or decrees. Steel communities like Hamilton and Sault Ste. Were proving that the experiment was successful. Almost immediately, Windsor and Marie were reborn. Lots that had been vacant since the outbreak were once again occupied. Workers were called back, and furnaces were rekindled. It was a huge wound for Detroit and a success for Canada. The loss of Canadian supplies was more than simply a challenge for businesses like Ford and General Motors. It was a financial setback, citing soaring steel and aluminum prices. Ford revealed $2.5 billion in higher expenses in the first half of 2025 in its mid-year disclosures. These were not fictitious numbers. Auto Forecast Solutions reports that the cost of raw materials increased 6 to 9% during the second quarter. Pickups and other steel-heavy vehicles were most affected by the rise, which reduced margins and increased uncertainty. Across several plants, shifts were canceled. Some assembly lines paused, while others reduced output. Michigan was particularly heavily struck by the shock. Unemployment, which had been stable at 4% in February 2024, increased to 5.4% by February 2025, the largest annual increase in the whole nation. If the pattern persisted, economists cautioned the Midwest as a whole might enter recession. However, Ottawa just announced a silent reallocation production without making any official announcements or imposing any punitive tariffs. Detroit had been abandoned and had not been assaulted. Autos were not the only source of the fallout. The oil fields in Alberta were also affected. Specialty steel used in Canadian energy pipelines has long been a niche sector controlled by American companies. These were high-value, high-precision items that sustained whole American foundries. However, that market vanished by 2025. The government of Alberta required that new pipelines only use domestic steel in response to Trump's 50% tariffs and Canada's own push for domestic industrial policy. Although the action was presented as green, it actually broke off relations with American suppliers, once promised to American mills. Contracts worth hundreds of thousands of tons of steel disappeared virtually immediately. The contracts remained in Canada and had not disappeared. As a result, one of the most integrated energy corridors in North America experienced a stealthy breach. Pipeline material stopped moving north, and steel stopped flowing south. Not only was the United States losing a client, but it was also losing a vital component of the infrastructure that supports a large portion of its energy cooperation with Ottawa. Pipe by pipe, what started out as a tariff fight over aluminum and automobiles had evolved into a much deeper dissociation. Washington exploded as supply chains broke down and manufacturing halted. The first legislators to gesture north were from the Midwest, which is the center of American manufacturing. Senators and representatives accused Canada of creating a disguised trade barrier in a rare bipartisan outburst. But Ottawa hadn't violated any of the rules: no tariffs, no subsidies, and no clear prohibitions. Just a discrete supply reallocation that is supported by security and environmental factors. The U.S. case was practically unsupportable from the perspective of international law, particularly before the WTO. The indignation was unabated by that. Hearings in Congress become political theater. Great Lakes lawmakers cautioned that rising steel and aluminum prices would devastate American construction budgets. Reports from auto executives predicted huge layoffs across supplier networks, reduced production, and narrower profits. Even though no one knew what could be done, lobbyists pushed politicians behind closed doors to take action. What began as Trump's tariff policy has now put Congress in a geopolitical stalemate without a definite antagonist or useful legal recourse. Pressure on Capitol Hill, as well as Detroit, grew daily in the meantime. In June 2025, former President Donald Trump triggered Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, a rarely utilized clause intended to defend national security. This decision, which was made quietly but had explosive implications, was at the center of it all. This time, it was used against Canada, America's primary source of steel and aluminum, and its long-standing ally, rather than strategic adversaries. A 50% tariff on all imports of those metals was imposed by the act. It was a surprise to international markets and a betrayal to Canadian business. Confusion pervaded even Trump's inner circle, as economic advisors who supported exemptions by citing extensive cross-border manufacturing integration were marginalized. There was no warning to governors of industrial states, such as Ohio and Michigan. Wall Street responded immediately, with steel futures going wild and stocks related to supply chain plunging. But Ottawa, on the other side of the border, made no declarations or retaliated. No formal embargo, no counter-tariffs, no press conferences. Canada decided to rewrite its internal regulations as a more subdued and effective weapon. It strengthened environmental criteria on sourcing, improved national security measures for energy infrastructure, and updated public procurement guidelines. Although these were not officially anti-American actions, in reality, they made it practically difficult to ship steel across the border. It was lawful, there was no sound, and it worked devastatingly well. American businesses who depended on Canadian steel found themselves without a supply in a matter of weeks. Shipments ceased abruptly, and long-term contracts were quietly terminated. It was referred to as a diplomatic freeze by analysts, but to people on the ground, it felt more like a tight economic grip. Protests got louder in Washington, but there were no practical answers. Lawmakers accused Ottawa of creating a shadow trade wall under the pretense of security requirements and green regulations. But since there were no discriminatory duties, prohibitions, or subsidies, there was no legal basis to contest the action. The United States had started the fire at the WTO, and Canada had just decided to leave. Trump anticipated a direct retaliation. Instead, something worse came, a surgically precise gradual suffocation. Originally intended as a show of force, that 50% tax swiftly became a self-imposed trap that shut off U.S. producers, infuriated local governments, and left Congress with no way out. There were simply growing losses and a broken relationship with a friend that had supported American industry for decades. No economic benefits to demonstrate. No diplomatic triumph to declare. A mistake was the root cause of every manufacturing slowdown, job loss, and pipeline contract cancellation. Ignoring that Canada already had the emergency escape prepared, Trump had constructed a wall. Preparation was what appeared to be revenge. Nearly everyone anticipated a furious reaction from Ottawa in the form of counter-tariffs and vehement comments when Trump startled international markets in June 2025 with his tariffs on steel and aluminum. However, Canada was ready and didn't need them. Its politicians have been secretly developing a new industrial ideology for months, one based on national resilience, clean energy, and self-sufficiency rather than conflict. In Washington, what appeared to be resistance turned out to be a proclamation of independence. No one in the U.S. Capitol dared to address the straightforward but crucial question. Was Canada merely moving on without the United States, or was it actually reacting? Ottawa started the Steel Modernization Fund, a $1 billion Canadian initiative to revitalize and reposition the country's steel industry as early as the beginning of 2025, prior to the tariff conflict. It is a structural project rather than a bailout. The fund focused on supply security for the energy transition, national military capability, and low-emission production methods. It was more important to make sure the nation would no longer rely on foreign markets to support its vital sectors than it was to keep the furnaces blazing. Simultaneously, Ottawa placed stringent restrictions on third country, apart from the U.S., steel imports, reducing permitted levels by 50% from the year before. A punitive 50% tariff was imposed after that. This was market management rather than traditional protectionism, viewing steel as a component of a supply chain rather than a commodity. Immediate implications included the elimination of the need for Canadian producers to undercut themselves against carbon-intensive or subsidized imports. Alternatively, they might upgrade plants, make stable plans, and invest in clean technology. The following action was considerably more focused. Strict requirements were applied when redesigning major infrastructure projects, ranging from transit systems to naval ships. Only steel that was recycled or produced in Canada and had to adhere to strict emissions limitations. Those who didn't fit the requirements weren't even permitted to bid. The domestic market suddenly became more stable, competitive, and in line with the nation's climate objectives. The end result was a steel industry that could meet the requirements of international trade regulations while also supplying the nation's infrastructure needs. The truth was different from Washington's accusations of disguised protectionism. No embargo, no manipulation of prices, no outright reprisal, only a systematic reassessment of the country's capabilities, conducted in accordance with guidelines that Canada had every right to establish. This was a structural change intended to liberate Ottawa from the turbulence of American politics and the turmoil of international commodities markets, not a short-term attack on the American economy. Canada wasn't merely responding. Instead, it was subtly changing the rules and opting to play a different game. And it was obvious why it was comfortable severing relations with its largest client. It wasn't merely changing suppliers. It was altering its industrial strategy from the ground up. Instead of responding, Canada is creating a sustainable, integrated steel industry that the U.S. will find difficult to replicate. A bold climate commitment at the heart of this change is the need that all significant steel facilities switch to electric arc furnaces, EAFs, by 2035. EAFs use electricity to melt scrap or pre-treated iron, reducing emissions and energy consumption in contrast to typical blast furnaces that burn coal-derived coke and emit large volumes of CO2. That's not all, though. EAFs are used in conjunction with direct reduced iron DRI technology, which is driven by natural gas and hydrogen rather than coal. The EAF plus DRI combination is now one of the cleanest ways to make steel, reducing emissions to almost nil in some situations compared to standard procedures. Canada has a distinct edge in this regard thanks to its electrical system. The steel provinces of Quebec and Ontario in Canada rely on ample hydro, wind, and nuclear energy, whereas the United States still primarily relies on fossil fuels to power its industry. In order to supply steel mills with clean electricity, these areas are likewise growing their grids. This is hard infrastructure, not green window dressing. Because of this, Canadian manufacturers are already ready to deal with the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, whereas American companies run the possibility of facing severe fines for continuing to use coal-based steel. It should come as no surprise that international automakers and builders are searching north for clean steel contracts to help them reach their ESG goals. The true question that the American industry ought to be asking is, why should the world continue to purchase steel from the United States, which is still dependent on carbon-intensive processes, if Canada can provide cleaner, more competitive, tariff-free steel to Europe and Asia? The race to control the resources of the upcoming industrial period has turned this into a geopolitical issue rather than merely an environmental one. Waiting for Washington is not an option for Canada. Budgets had to be revised and U.S. building projects halted, but Ottawa had already taken action by completely reimagining the steel cycle from the ground up rather than depending on imports. By mid-2025, the Canadian Construction Association raised the alarm that more domestic steel was required as markets were being squeezed and supply to the United States were decreasing. Such a signal would have caused panic in many other nations. But in Canada, it led to focused action. Ottawa decided to fortify its recycling system rather than only increase primary production. A 35% tax credit for producers who use trash as their primary input was at the center of this shift. That incentive was sufficient for many medium-sized and large businesses to convert whole facilities. The objective was geopolitical, strategic, and environmental in addition to economic, particularly when process and electric arc furnaces that run on renewable energy. Recycled steel emits significantly less carbon than steel generated from virgin ore, a fact that some Canadian provinces have already been able to attest to. Canadian manufacturers found themselves providing something the U.S. could not readily imitate: clean steel within a closed, completely traceable supply chain. As foreign purchasers, ranging from European automakers to Asian infrastructure funds, sought low-emission materials. Ottawa did not act alone in enabling all of this. Provincial governments were enlisted with specific funding to establish regional recycling ecosystems. Municipalities were encouraged to separate and resell metal for industrial reuse. Processing facilities were updated, and scrap collection programs were extended. These supply chains were closely linked to steel factories in Ontario and Quebec, making the shift to carbon neutrality. The outcome was a rare triple win: supply chain independence, price stability, and emission reductions. Politics in the United States, meanwhile, continued to be mired in hearings and accusing Canada of being responsible for the cost increases. On bridges, roadways, and public housing projects, construction companies in states, including Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, complained about blown budgets, canceled bids, and delays. However, the circular cycle based on clean energy and recycling, the real structural solution, was not even on the menu. The actual question the U.S. should be asking is this: what is stopping Washington from repurposing its own waste to stabilize prices, reduce emissions, and secure supply, just as Canada's done? Because smarter systems, rather than more imports, are what create resilience in today's economy. Canada has just demonstrated this. With calm precision, Ottawa redefined not only who would buy its steel, but also why, while the United States rushed to mend trade rifts and quell domestic anger. Exporting tons is no longer a metric of success. The goal of the new Canadian model is to be essential to the industries of the future, not to be everywhere. The Carbon Passport, a certification that ensures steel was produced under low-emission norms rather than just a label, is at the heart of this approach and is a key agreement with the European Union. In exchange, that material is granted access to European markets free from the environment levies enforced by the new government in Brussels. It is a pass to the most competitive marketplaces in the world, and Canada now has it. This is where the question turns into a geopolitical one. Steel is now a climate diplomacy tool, not just a commodity, as Ottawa has made clear. These days, exports are focused on industries that represent the nation's environmental concerns, such as infrastructure, nuclear energy, electric cars, and environmentally friendly public transportation. Those that are unable to prove they have real decarbonization goals are either placed at the bottom of the list or not included at all. Policy is changing behavior even at home. In addition to receiving recognition, businesses who successfully complete the federal Net Zero Challenge are given preferential access to export markets and assistance in growing their clean manufacturing capabilities. Innovation is now rewarded with real opportunities. It is no longer optional. This is now a climate plan integrated with trade policy and a country's global image, not merely a steel strategy. The challenge that now presents itself to the United States is this: if Canada exports low-carbon credibility in addition to steel, what precisely are the U.S. exports? Trump erected a wall. Ottawa constructed a ladder. And as a result of that decision, the trade balance in North America may have shifted irrevocably. The silent breakdown of a decades-long economic dependency is what started out as a tariff dispute but has since grown into something more complex. Ottawa discovered leverage via design, whereas Washington sought it through force. The United States increased its reliance on fossil fuels and obsolete manufacturing, while Canada made investments in supply chain autonomy, climate-aligned trade deals, and hydro-powered steel. Therefore, Ottawa stood at the gate with a passport in hand, offering clean steel from Ontario and Quebec that was powered by hydropower when Europe raised its carbon wall. The fact that Canada no longer has to quit the U.S. market to do so is precisely what should worry Washington. Without any hoopla or threats, merely the force of gravity will make the strategic decoupling reality. All that is required is the opening of a bridge to Brussels. So, the true question is straightforward. What if this was a reallocation of priorities rather than a trade war? Not policies against policies, but future versus past, with one nation influencing tomorrow's sectors and the other on the left protecting yesterday's. Thank you for watching the video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.